Welcome to Indus Special. I'm Ejaz Haider. Last Sunday, Prime Minister Imran Khan went to Tehran, where he met the Iranian President Dr. Hassan Rouhani and also the Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. At a joint presser the same day, Rouhani said that Iran seeks to resolve issues in the region through dialogue. Referring to his talks with Khan, Rouhani also said that our two countries emphasized that regional issues could only be resolved through political means and dialogue. We openly welcome any goodwill gesture by Pakistan for providing more peace and stability for the whole region, and we are ready to assist Pakistan for providing full peace and stability for the whole region, unquote. Khan then went to Riyadh, where he met Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman on Tuesday evening. The Saudi trip somewhat lacked the profile of the Tehran leg. The Saudi statements did not mention Iran and said that during the meeting, Khan and Mohammed bin Salman reviewed strong ties between the two brotherly countries and fields of joint cooperation, as well as ways of enhancing them. They also discussed the latest developments in the region and a number of issues of common interest. The Pakistani statement said that Khan had stressed the need to resolve regional peace and stability, differences and disputes through political means and diplomacy. Pakistan has also offered Islamabad as the meeting venue to the Iranian and Saudi sides for parleys. Meanwhile, Chinese President Xi Jinping, in his unofficial second summit with Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi, has proposed a trilateral framework that can help China, Pakistan, and India to resolve issues and ensure peace through dialogue and without being influenced by extra-regional parties. It is interesting that India's actions since it aggressed against Pakistan last February stand in complete contrast to Pakistani and Chinese diplomacy that seeks for peace in South and West Asia as well as the greater Middle East. To discuss this, we have with us Mostafa Koshcheshm, who is an Iranian writer, analyst, and joins us from Tehran. Hassan Akbar, who is also an analyst and director of Jinnah Institute, and Ambassador Asif Durrani, both of them joining us from Islamabad. Let me begin with Hassan. Hassan, I was going through the analysis put out by Al Jazeera, and it quotes you saying the role of mediation reinforces Pakistan's neutrality, which is positive for Pakistan. And you also said it allows Pakistan to sidestep the inevitable question of choosing sides. That's a very interesting insight. Would you care to elaborate on this?
Yeah, Ejaz. A lot of people have been asking the question about what can Pakistan achieve in mediating between two regional powers that have had disputes for many years now and strategic concerns about each other's role in the greater region. And there, I think, Pakistan's mediation may not be able to resolve some of the long-standing concerns that the Saudis have, for example, about Iran's nuclear weapons or Iran's role in the Middle East, or the Iranians' concerns about Saudi actions in Yemen. But what Pakistan can achieve is that it can reinforce its position as a neutral player through the mediation process. Because what mediation does allow is for Pakistan to be presented both in Riyadh as well as in Tehran as a player that is neutral, that is able to listen to both sides and provide a diplomatic way forward and a political way forward to avoid immediate conflict. So I think if you look at Pakistan's strategic interests in ensuring that there is no breakout of hostilities between Saudi Arabia and Iran, I think it has direct strategic implications for Pakistan because Iran is our neighbor and we have long-standing ties with Saudi Arabia. So in that sense, I think this is reinforcing the fact that we've stayed neutral between these two important players and that role is reinforced when we come in a mediatory role in the conflict between Saudi Arabia and Iran.
Absolutely. That's very interesting. And just to support what you're saying, in fact, to quote from what Prime Minister Khan said during the joint presser, he said Iran is our neighbor, ties with Iran go a long way back. He also said, and I quote again from what he said, Saudi Arabia has been one of our closest friends. Saudi Arabia has helped us when we have been in need. The reason for this trip is that we do not want a conflict between Saudi Arabia and Iran. We recognize that it is a complex issue. And it's interesting and it's insightful that you're using a different framework from what some of the critics have been using, i.e., that what exactly has been the substance of this trip. But let me hop over to Mostafa Koshcheshm in Tehran. Mustafa, give us a sense of how you have looked at this visit by the Pakistani Prime Minister and also the joint presser with President Rouhani actually saying very openly that we are prepared to help Pakistan mediate or facilitate. It seems to me that that was a very important statement.
Hello, and thanks for having me. Well, Imran Khan is a smart official and a smart person. Of course, Pakistan is in good terms with both nations. It represents Tehran's interest section in Washington in absence of official talks, official relations and diplomatic relations. And also, Pakistan shares borders with Iran, though there have been grievances all throughout the last 10, 20 years from the Iranian side about the operation of some militant groups in cross-border attacks against Iran, and Iran has been complaining about lax control over the border. Still, the two countries have very good ties. As you remember, before Imran Khan paid the visit to Tehran, I appeared in a similar interview with Indus TV, and I appeared on your show. And I said, Tehran has been always ready to resolve problems and differences with the regional nations, especially the Saudis, through dialogue. Iran has offered establishment of a regional forum for dialogue, especially to resolve differences with Saudi Arabia. That has already received a cold welcome from the side of Riyadh. Also, Iran has offered the Hormuz Peace Initiative when the Iranian delegation was present at the UN General Assembly and the issue was raised by President Rouhani. It was also given a cold shoulder from the side of the Saudis as well as the Americans. So if you just go back through to 30 years ago, probably, or 40 years ago, after the Islamic Revolution, Iran has been offering 6 plans and proposals in order to de-escalate the situation, not just in the region, but in the whole world. Like WAVE, the World Without Violence, that received an endorsement of the UN General Assembly 2-3 years ago. Like Civilization, Dialogue Among Civilization, that was proposed by President Khatami. So when Imran Khan was in Tehran, of course, he was given a welcome, and his idea of mediation was welcomed. But as I said then in that interview before his visit, that the answer to the success of this mediation depends on Riyadh. Riyadh has been faced with a number of challenges recently that has made the Saudi officials more sober. I believe this is the age of awakening for them, especially after Donald Trump made sure that the United States Army would not go into a fight and war with Iran.
Mustafa, that's a new to which I will come shortly. But let me just go to Ambassador Durrani for his insights, because he was also our ambassador to Iran. Ambassador Durrani, give us a sense of Pakistan-Iran relations and how Pakistan balances the equation between Iran and Saudi Arabia, given that one is a neighbor and the ties go back, as the Prime Minister said, a long way back, and the other with which we have very close relations for a completely different set of reasons.
Yeah, thank you, Ejaz. You have set the tone in your intro, and there's no doubt Pakistan, Iran, they always enjoyed best of the relations. Of course, there may have been certain differences in the perception, but overall, there is no dispute between Iran and Pakistan, which normally sometimes media projects. It's not. Mr. Koshcheshm has pointed out towards this border. These things are, I'm sure he must be aware of the right of easement on both sides on border issues, where the Baloch on both sides of the border, they can travel 60 kilometers on each side. And that's how, and then there have been our dissidents taking shelter in Iran and Balochistan. Those have been the issues. But overall, Iran and Pakistan have stood by each other always historically. As late as 2008 on the IAEA nuclear issue, Iran, in fact, was hard-pressed. India voted against Iran. Pakistan stood by Iran. So there's a long history of standing by each other. Iran always supported us during 65 war and 71 wars. Iran was the first country to recognize Pakistan. So there is when we talk about Iran, there's a trade, even despite all these sanctions, almost $1.35 billion trade going on between the two countries. Of course, there could be some non-traditional way which are being used, including smuggling and all that, but that always happens among the neighbors. France and Britain do that. Geneva, you cross from Geneva to France, and there's smuggling going on, especially on liquors and cigarettes. So this goes on. But what I'm trying to say is that with regard to Iran, we have a comfortable relationship, and Iran knows that. We never had our troops along the Iranian borders historically. It was upon Iran's request that we had to create a southern command of the FC with almost 13,000 soldiers which have been deployed, and it has made a difference, and the Iranian leadership has acknowledged that on so many occasions. I'm privy to that. When it comes to Saudi Arabia, of course, there's an emotional attachment to Saudi Arabia that is there. Saudi Arabia has been helping Pakistan on many occasions, and then we have almost 2 million Pakistanis working there. But having said that, despite the fact, but for Pakistan, maintaining a balance between the two Muslim countries, because if we take sides, then it means then we will be a party to the dispute. We don't want to be a party to the dispute. Rather, we will encourage the countries, and they are Muslim countries, and then they should also realize that right now the turmoil in this world, overall, if you look at the map, only the greater Middle East where you find Muslim countries at each other's throat. So this needs to be addressed, and this needs to be addressed very seriously. And I think Prime Minister Khan has taken a bold initiative, and hopefully, whether some positive results comes out or not, but the immediate result is that the tempers have been lowered down, and this has at least averted the risk of the war, which we could see after attack on Aramco facilities.
Absolutely. On this note, let me go Hassan Akbar, because once again, he believes that it is unlikely that Pakistan would be able to allay Saudi Arabian strategic concerns about Iran, particularly regarding the nuclear capability, but that entering into a mediating role provides a path through which immediate tensions can be diffused. This is essentially the crux of what you were saying, Hassan. Just elaborate a little on this, because at some point, it's not just, of course, we've decided that, we've agreed that the framework is that Pakistan is not going to take sides. It establishes Pakistan's neutrality. But if Pakistan has to facilitate, as the Prime Minister said, offering Islamabad as a venue to both the sides for parleys, that, some substance needs also to be discussed. Is there any possibility, are there any areas where the substance could actually be addressed?
Yeah, Ejaz, I think the immediate area where immediate topic which is substantive, which can be discussed during these talks, is Yemen, because I think that there's been it's been 4 years now in Yemen that Saudi Arabia has been fighting the war. There's been very little success for the Saudi forces and for the UAE in Yemen. We know recently that there's been a Yemeni offensive near Najran, where they took on almost a brigade-sized force, larger force than that, and they were able to rout them out. So the Saudis, I think, realize that the Yemen conflict is not working out in their favor. They've lost a lot of money and material in the Yemeni conflict. So can there be a negotiated settlement in the conflict with the Houthis? I think that would be the first topic of discussion. I don't think that concerns vis-a-vis Syria, Iraq, can be resolved immediately. I think those are long-standing concerns about affairs of influence.
Hassan, hold on. Let me ask you something. Because on Yemen, there are these positions that appear to be irreconcilable in the sense, for instance, that for the Saudis, the concern is that if the Houthis come to power, in tandem with certain other allies, that they will have been encircled by Iran because the Houthis are allied with Iran. Now, that's a huge Saudi concern. I think one of the reasons they're still stuck in that absolutely ridiculous war is because of this. On the other hand, Iran, actually has been supporting the Houthis, directly or indirectly. So, how do we sort of reconcile this? I mean, the Iranian alliance with the Houthis and the Saudi concern about not being encircled by Iran.
I think, Ejaz, the Saudis have been encircled because of the conflict. The fact is that a lot of the weapons that we're now seeing being used by the Houthis are being provided by the Iranians, and the Saudis are not able to do anything about it. So, Saudi concern is...
Hassan, sorry, I have to cut into what you're saying, but let me just take this to Mostafa Koshcheshm because I need to let him go also. Mostafa, Hassan has essentially identified Yemen as one of the areas where something could be done. Now, I've voiced the concerns of the Saudis and also that the Iranians have an alliance with the Houthis. Do you get a sense that that is an area where perhaps some kind of middle ground could be found?
I say that the Saudis, after Donald Trump said he would not go to fight with Iran, and after he left the courts alone in northern Syria, he proved to be an unreliable partner for everyone. And the Saudis and Arabs have come to realize this. Now, I believe after the UAE started the shift in foreign policy, the Saudis are now on the edge of actually on the brink of a major decision. Should they start de-escalating the situation with Iran, and now in this situation that they are weak and they have so many problems and they cannot sustain.
So you do believe there is space there. Thank you so much. That was Mostafa Koshcheshm giving us his insights. Let me take this to Ambassador Durrani. Ambassador Durrani, your thoughts on this?
Well, I think certain CBMs are needed between Saudi Arabia and Iran. For instance, Iran will have to give certain answers with regard to its role in Yemen. So that is very important, and they'll have to raise the trust level of the Saudis. Similarly, Saudis will also have to realize that they neglected Yemen, and that's why they have to face the situation in their backyard. And same is the case with regard to Saudi's involvement with the Americans. They have to, I think, mellow down and tone down their rhetoric about Iran as well. And there are many issues which Iran can, in fact, contribute in resolving the Middle East crisis. And Iran is the largest country in the region. Of course, Turkey is there. But Iran's direct involvement with the Gulf states and then its involvement in Bahrain and other small states, that needs to be reconsidered. And Iran is the largest country, so it has to show leadership. And Saudi Arabia and Iran and Saudi Arabia actually, on the ideological front, they have to, in fact, tone down their rhetoric because this is the main reason of tensions in the region. Yes.
This is the main reason for tension in the region. Thank you so much. That was Ambassador Asif Durrani speaking with us. We're going to take a short break, and when we return, we'll discuss, as I said in my opening, President Xi Jinping's sort of trilateral framework and the situation in South Asia. Stay with us. Welcome back to Indus Special. Now we come to South Asia. And as I said earlier in the opening, that in his unofficial second summit with Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi, Xi Jinping, the Chinese president, proposed a trilateral framework that can help Pakistan, China, and India And this was something that the Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi also said. And in fact, to quote him, President Xi Jinping stressed the Chinese side sincerely expects sound China-India relations, China-Pakistan relations, and India-Pakistan relations. I also said that this is Prime Minister Khan's visit to Iran and Saudi Arabia, trying to facilitate Xi Jinping talking about peace in this region, is in sharp contrast to how India has been behaving since February when it aggressed against Pakistan, and also since August 5th when it revoked the sort of semi-autonomy of the occupied state of Jammu and Kashmir and annexed it. To discuss this, we now are also joined by Dorsey, a prolific writer dealing with the politics and geopolitics of this region, South, West Asia, the Greater Middle East. James, thank you for being on the program. Give me a sense of, as I said, there's a contrast between how India seems to be behaving and how Pakistan and China are trying to somehow work out the diplomatic options. What's your sense?
Well, first of all, it's always a pleasure to be with you, Hassan. I think what you're seeing is a pattern that actually goes beyond South Asia or West Asia, for that matter, which is that increasingly you have a rise of civilizational leaders who view the way they handle things internally as domestic issues. So you're hearing that very clearly, for example, from the Indian Prime Minister Modi when it comes to Kashmir. And you're hearing a similar attitude at the moment from the Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan with regard to his invasion in Syria. So it fits a pattern that we're seeing that is sort of globally evolving.
So are you saying that this is a pattern that needs to change somehow? And if that be so, what kind of, like we've seen the United Nations obviously is hamstrung by various reasons, the vetoes and the rest of it, and the state interests, and so on and so forth. So what kind of alternate framework can there be in order for the peoples to have their right to self-determination?
I don't think it's simply a question of an alternative framework. What I really think it's seeing is we have leaders who think in civilizational terms, which means that they no longer necessarily think in terms of national borders.
Okay, that's a very interesting thought, James, because...
But if I may just carry this thought on,
sure.
They also do not think in terms of adherence to international law.
Well...
So if you're talking about alternative frameworks, you have to have a basis, and the very basis on which the world is constructed post-World War II in order is essentially being neglected and denied.
Okay, so neoliberalism is not only under attack within states, but also the international order that was kind of constructed in many ways on the basis of neoliberalism in terms of a rules-based system. It's sort of breaking down internationally also. Is that what you're saying?
That's what I'm saying, except for that I would not tie this to liberalism or neoliberalism. You need to have a set of rules and regulations by which you deal with one another. That usually is legally anchored, irrespective of what kind of political system or world order you're talking about. That very system is breaking down. Those very
okay,
rules
James, last question. When you say civilizational, are you using the term in the Huntingtonian sense?
Not at all. Not at all. I'm not talking about a clash of civilizations. What I'm talking about is Vladimir Putin. Namely, the borders of that state are defined by a civilizational group. So in Putin's case, it is the Russian world. So you've had interventions in 2008 in Georgia, 2014 Ukraine, and you can point to other examples with other leaders.
Okay. Thank you. That was James Dorsey speaking with us. Hassan, he said something interesting. The reason I said whether he's using it in an Huntingtonian sense, I was talking about the use of the term civilization per se, not about clash of civilization. But if you look at structural realism, this then becomes a Thucydides trap, as Graham Allison calls it. So this civilizational approach, do you think that the states will be able to actually defy the Thucydides trap?
I mean, I don't think we're there yet, Ejaz. I know that there's redefining of security threats and nationalistic interpretation of regions around big states that have power. And so perhaps they are thinking more in terms of nationalism. You can also call it civilizational thinking. And it's reminiscent, I think, of, in some ways, of what we saw in Germany before, at the start of the Second World War, where essentially Germany's point of view, Nazi Germany's point of view, was to increase the borders of German state to in Austria, in Czechoslovakia, where there were German-speaking people.
The whole concept of Lebensraum.
Exactly. So I think it's reflective of that, but I think it comes from a deep-seated, deep-rooted reaction across the world and across communities to increasing globalization and increasing connectivity across the world. Because what we're seeing now is that leaderships across the world, and Narendra Modi is no different, are reacting to very base instincts amongst their electorate, and that's paying them off. If you look at the recent election campaigns that Modi has held in Haryana, for example, again, it's a very base instinct, talking about water, talking about the right of living, and how Modi will take water away from Pakistan and give it to the farmers in Haryana. And if that is the level of discourse that we're seeing amongst populist governments and populist leaders, then it's of course worrying, because they need to otherize somebody else, and usually it's a neighbor or a community within themselves.
I'm happy you talked about it. Tell me, when I say, and I've repeated this a couple of times on this program, that there seems to be a contrast between how the Chinese and the Pakistanis are going about trying to use diplomacy, trying to seek peace. So there's a contrast between how Beijing and Islamabad has been acting and how Delhi has been acting. Would you agree with my proposition there?
So I do think so, especially in the international, if you look at their foreign relations. Recently, China historically, as you know, Ejaz, has been a very nuanced and subtle state. They have not been an aggressive state when it comes to Chinese interests outside the state, the boundaries of China. While they may have been extremely aggressive inside China, their role outside has always been more accommodative, trying to resolve issues through dialogue and find political solutions to disputes, including disputes such as the border dispute with India, for example, etc. And Pakistan recently has seen a shift, because we've seen years of war, and we know what war does to communities and the kind of sacrifice that communities and people have to give for war. And Pakistan has learned from that, certainly. So Pakistan and China's approach to the wider region, where we see a lot of conflict happening, at least in our greater region, including the greater Middle East, in Afghanistan, etc. From those experiences, I think Pakistan wants to avoid conflict on all sides, including Kashmir. But what we're seeing in India is a very, very aggressive, very hawkish approach from the government in New Delhi, which frankly has become even more aggressive after the 5th of August.
Which brings me to another issue here, Hassan. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I get a sense over the last 3 or 4 elections, in fact, that Pakistan appears to be a winner for any party that invokes the Pakistani bogey. Do you think my sense is correct there? Because we haven't seen that in relation to India and Pakistani elections.
Not at all. I mean, it's quite the opposite in Pakistan. If you remember, in the last many elections in Pakistan, every prime minister who has won has actually fought on a platform of improving relations with India. This is not the same in India. In fact, what's even more surprising, Ejaz, is that the rhetoric continues even in state elections in India. I will remind you of, for example, which clearly identify how Pakistan is a bogey. In Gujarat, when there was a very tough competition being faced by the BJP in Gujarat recently in the last election, state elections, the opposition Congress politicians were accused of being part of some Pakistani plot to defeat the BJP in Gujarat. I mean, that exemplifies, I think, the kind of fear and paranoia that we're seeing being fed to the public by the government and by very hardline news channels. Now, let's not forget that since before August 5th, we've seen a number of these red alerts being issued by and coming on television every hour in India, from fishing boats found in Gujarat to people having come in the south of India into
Absolutely,
Tamil Nadu,
Hassan, hold that thought. I'm also joined by Ruwa Shah, who's a Kashmiri writer, analyst, studying filmmaking in Turkey. Ruwa, thank you for being on the program. We're talking about a couple of things. One, that the Indian elections, whoever invokes the Pakistani bogey seems to win them, whereas in Pakistan, every party talks about normalization with India. Now, given the present situation, we were actually talking about what Modi said in Haryana with reference to water. Obviously, it's a casus belli if an upper riparian actually threatens a lower riparian with stoppage of water. But most of that we've already discussed, Hassan and I. But I want you to give us a sense of the long and dark night that is going on in occupied and annexed Kashmir. What is the latest from there?
They are saying that the telephone lines have been started, but only the postpaid connections have been started, and there is absolutely no other sort of communication with the families. For example, people like us who are living out of India are still not able to call their families because it does not easily connect. B, majority of the population do not use postpaid mobiles. There's the bulk of the population is using the prepaid connections. So by the way, I was able to call my mother yesterday, and she told me that there is a rumor that they might again shut down even the postpaid phones that have been started again. So there is a lot of uncertainty.
So this was the first that you spoke with your mother since
Yes.
August 5th?
In the last 72 days, yes.
Okay.
And the information I got from my family is nothing but horrifying, terribly painful, because I got to know that she has gone through a lot of ailments. My relatives have suffered a lot. My cousin has been arrested. These things might seem very normal to talk about right now, but it is not actually normal, and it's like everything is coming down, falling on you all together. And this is just a normal thing, but others might have heard more. The deaths have happened and people were not informed about those. We are seeing people from Kashmir posting about those things. So I think
I recently saw a video on the social media of an elderly, very graceful lady who apparently told me is the wife of a former justice of Jammu and Kashmir High Court. She was talking essentially peacefully, and then the police came and arrested her. And Hassan, then the police just arrested her, pushed her into this woman must be in her late 60s perhaps, and put her in a police vehicle and took her away. That seems to now be a sort of normal pattern, the new normal in the occupied and annexed state.
Yeah, Ejaz, and that was a heartbreaking video, if you remember. She wasn't talking about violence or any such thing. She was just raising her voice against the ban and against basic fundamental human rights which were being denied to to Kashmiri people, in the cities and villages. And the way that she was put into the van, there's in that protest, this was by, some prominent women leaders in Kashmir. They were, all of them were arrested, including, I believe, a woman as old as 80 years old. And this comes as we have reports of over 14,000 young men having been picked up from their villages, from major cities such as Srinagar, because of the fear of protest. Let me remind you, I think what I heard right now is very instructive, because right after the post-paid ban was removed, this protest took place. So perhaps the Indian government is looking at this as a concern. Increasingly, we're hearing less and less voices. Even the international media that was reporting initially isn't being given the same kind of access that they were getting previously in the first few weeks of the clampdown in Kashmir. So I think repression is certainly growing. Whereas the Indian government likes to portray this image of normalization, I think it's far from it. The other issue, Ejaz, that I would like to highlight is also something that we don't hear a lot about on our media, which is what's happening on the line of control. I know that ceasefire violations have been, and we've worked on this and we've talked about this many times, have been normal before 2003. But I think this current spate of ceasefire violations is actually abnormal. Because the kind of civilian deaths that we've seen in the last 2 weeks is increasing. There's loss of life and property. There's very heavy artillery fire happening on the line of control. So, and the chief was there recently, the chief of army staff, and they came out with a statement about these very violations being committed by India. So the situation in Kashmir is actually worsening. And I fear, frankly, that this current impasse of, in some ways, no war, no peace, this cannot continue. The oppression against the Kashmiri people is a sentimental issue, is a strategic issue for Pakistan. And there's a limit to, inaction from the side. There's a growing pressure also within Pakistan about what we are doing to alleviate the kind of aggressive brutalities being witnessed by Kashmiris in Indian-occupied Kashmir.
Absolutely.
So
I'm happy, Hassan, that you talked about the line of control, because one of the problems that the Pakistan Army faces is that it has to identify military targets, because the Indian side goes for indiscriminate shelling and firing, and we've seen lots of civilians being martyred because of their firing, but we have to be very careful about what targets we need to choose in order to neutralize their fire. But thank you so much. That was Hassan Akbar speaking with us. This is all for today from Indus News. We shall see you tomorrow. Until then, it's goodbye.